What is better than one ring of 12 shining souls inside the sun? Sì tosto come l'ultima parola, la benedetta fiamma per dir tolse, a rotar cominciò la santa mola. Welcome everyone. We are going to read Canto 12 of Paradiso today. I'm excited because this is the continuation of a great canto, Canto 11, and we are still in the sphere of the sun. And this particular canto, Canto 12, is really the symmetrical canto, or almost the mirror canto to Canto 11. So the same beauty that we've seen in Canto 11 shines through this canto as well, although through different characters and different elements. If we were to summarize Canto 12 of Paradiso, we should say that it starts with the secondary crown of spirits, 12 more spirits going in circle around the first circle of 12 spirits for a total of 24. Then we have a monologue by a Franciscan who is going to celebrate the life of Saint Dominic. And in the end, we're going to have a reprimanding or scolding of the Franciscans by the same Franciscan person who is Saint Bonaventure, and a conclusion which presents the names of these new 12 blessed souls, closing the circle that has started, the narrative circle that has started in Canto 10. So we have 10, 11, and 12. So the canto is very similar to Canto 11, with maybe the striking difference that when celebrating and singing the life of St. Francis, Dante, through the mouth of St. Thomas, had been very personal, citing three crucial episodes in Francis' biography, in Francis' history, and making it very real, very historical. In the case of St. Dominic, maybe because he had less proper history at hand, we're not sure, but the way he presents the life of St. Dominic is more based on legends, and so a little bit more impersonal rather than personal. In fact, this canto is more about the impact of the Dominican order and Saint Dominic rather than his life in the details like we've seen for Saint Francis. But other than that, Canto 12 is really a parallel canto that runs in parallel with Canto 11. I would say the first 30 verses are crazy for how beautiful they are and for how Dante fuses together many different senses. He talks about visual elements using sound effects. So he uses this kind of syncretism of artistic tools and artistic elements. And they're just beautiful. The saints in these lights and circles that are circling Dante and Beatrice, who are in the middle of them, in the center, are singing. They are producing music and sound and singing that is extremely beautiful. It's also echoing, in a sense, the music that we heard at the end of Canto 10, the little tin that Dante gave us at the end of Canto 10. Here at verse 4, Dante is describing this second circle or second halo, we can call it, that is taking position almost like a spaceship around the first halo that is circling Dante and Beatrice. And he says, e nel suo giro tutta non si volse, prima che un'altra di cerchio la chiuse, e moto a moto e canto a canto colse. You can hear how singable these verses are. E moto a moto e canto a canto colse, which Mandelbaum translates as emotion matched with motion, song with song. Motion and motion, song with song. Canto che tanto vince nostre muse. How can you translate this musical verses? It's, I would say, almost impossible in English. Mandelbaum says here, a song that's sung by those sweet instruments. It's beautiful, but here in Italian is canto che tanto vince nostre muse, in a perfect endecassyllab. And nostre serene in quelle dolci tube. These tube are technically the trumpets, and he's using the term trumpets to refer to the voices of the blessed souls. The voices of the blessed souls are producing a music that his muses of Dante, his poetical powers and his sirens, whatever is the inspiration of Dante, is not sufficient to be able to replicate them or to even express them. Quanto primo splendor quel che refuse. The direct ray of light, is far superior to the reflected ray. And now we get to the best image of the entire canto, which is the double rainbow. Dante is describing a double rainbow. Come se volgon per tenera nube due archi paralleli e con colori, quando Iunone a sua ancella iube, nascendo di quel dentro quel di fuori, a guisa del parlare, etc., etc. So there are two rainbows that are really echoing themselves, but they are mirroring themselves, which is a visual simile. But in Dante's verses, they become echoing themselves almost as sounds, because he's talking about Juno, the goddess, who commanded her handmaid or her messenger, who was Iris. Iris, she was the nymph who prepared the, let's say, path for Juno to come to Earth, all beautiful and in all the colors of the rainbow. The outer rainbow is echoing the inner rainbow, much like the voice of one, the wandering nymph. He's referring to Echo here, the nymph Echo, who, we know, for love of Narcissus, she died. She consumed herself. She became, according to Ovid, only bones and voice. And then the gods transformed her bones into stones, and all that was left of her was the voice in the air. E fanno qui la gente esser presaga. And those two bows let people hear foretell by reason of the pact God made with Noah. When he says here, he means here on earth, where Dante is writing, because this is actually Dante's voice where he's writing. And we have Robin Kirkpatrick translating this in a maybe slightly clearer way, more understandable, where he says, and these arcs show for people here on earth, so he spells it out, he articulates for people here on earth, as tokens of the pact God made with Noah, the world would never suffer flood again. Così di quelle sempiterne rose volgensi circa noi le due ghirlande, e sì l'estrema all'intima rispose. L'estrema is the outer, the outward. Rispose means answered to the inner in singing. Mandelbaum says, and so the outer circle mime the inner ring. Rather than miming, it's a sound that Dante is referring to, the echo in singing. Poiché il tripudio e l'altra festa grande, sì del cantare e sì del fiammeggiarsi, luce con luce, gaudiose e blande. There is festivity, there is celebration and intense joy in these verses. Insieme appunto e a voler quietarsi, so they all stopped at a certain point in the same place and in the same moment, punto, e a voler quietarsi, with the same type of will. So in the same moment and with the same type of will, punto and voler, del cor de luna, delle luci nove, si mosse voce, che l'ago alla stella parer mi fece, involgermi al suo dove. From the heart of one of these 12 new lights, a voice came out and it made me look, because I was so attentive and concentrated towards that light, exactly like the needle in a compass that is pointing towards the polar star. So it's such a perfect comparison, because he's really inside the circle and he's in the center of it, looking like the needle pointing towards the polar star. After this awesome introduction of 30 verses, full of happiness and celebration, the monologue starts, and so the voice of the soul starts speaking. It's very interesting. At verse 31, the first words that the soul utters are "L'amor che mi fa bella mi tragge ragionar." In English, Mandelbaum translates, "The love that makes me fair draws me to speak," etc. And there is no gender. In the Italian, "L'amor che mi fa bella," because bella is of a female subject, while if it was male, it would be bello, it means that it's referred to a subject that is female. But we know that he is a saint who is male, who's Saint Bonaventure. So what's the mystery here? Why is Saint Bonaventure speaking in the female? It's because he's referring to himself as a soul, which in Italian is said anima. and the word anima in Italian is female. So this game of gender among all the names and terms in Italian is something that is something of a headache that English language doesn't have, because you have to respect every single male and female names in Italian, and on the English grammar side, you generally don't have to worry too much about this. When this soul says my own leader and the other leader, we know that it's a Franciscan speaking, so my own leader is Saint Francis, and the other leader is Saint Dominic. This is the structure that Dante is playing with. And I can make a comment right away about this very peculiar decision by Dante of making a Dominican praise and celebrate the life of Francis, and make a Franciscan praise and celebrate the life of Saint Dominic. And both of them are then at the end of their monologues scolding their own movement and the weaknesses and the corruption of their own movement. Why is Dante doing this? In part because there was a tradition of not only rivalry between the orders, but also of rhetorical confrontations in universities. And so Dante is following a little bit the structure. But also, more importantly, Dante is giving us yet another less spiritual lesson here, which is that of humility and to distance ourselves from pride as much as possible. We don't want, he didn't want a Franciscan criticizing the Dominicans and vice versa, because that would have been really against the gospel teachings. And it's not a complete coincidence, maybe, that today's gospel, today is Sunday, in February the 27th of 2022, and today's gospel talks about the end of the Beatitudes in Luke's gospel, where Jesus talks about the blind following the blind, and also mentions the famous speck of straw in your neighbor's eye versus the log that is coming out of your own eye. Very important spiritual lesson. Saint Bonaventure says that it's just fair, è giusto, or degno è che, I'm reading verse 34, degno è che, which means it's fair, it is right, says Mandelbaum, that just like we have introduced St. Francis, we're going to introduce St. Dominic as well, because they fought together, they fought the same battle against evil, and just in the same way is fair that their glory will shine together in the same way, with the same intensity. L'esercito di Cristo, che sì caro costò a riarmar, dietro la insegna si movea tardo, sospicioso e raro. Here Dante is getting into the spiritual issues and weakness that the church was suffering just before the Franciscan and the Dominican orders were founded by St. Francis and St. Dominic. Around the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century, the church was not in a good state. There was an incredible amount of corruption. There was very low motivation. When the emperor who rules forever held his ranks in danger by providing two champions, and these two champions were St. Francis and St. Dominic, to reinvigorate the life of the church. Not only the church was suffering from weakness, but in this type of scenario of weakness, many heresies had been born all around Europe, and in particular Dante is thinking about the Cathars here. And so we're going to touch on the point of the Cathars later, because it's an important heresy, and it's part of an important history that has to do with both St. Francis and specifically St. Dominic. Just like in Canto XI, Dante started with his cinematography showing us Assisi from the mountains and the beautiful landscapes. Here at verse 46, he shows us the mirror image, because St. Francis was all about being the sun rising from the east. And in this case, for St. Dominic, he's showing us the west, because St. Dominic was from Spain. So in that part where the zephyr, the gentle zephyr, rises to open the new leaves in which Europe appears reclothed, and where the sun goes to disappear in the waves, because that's where the sunset is, is sitting in the lucky Calaroga. This is the town, the Spanish town, where Saint Dominic was born. From here, Saint Bonaventure gives us three main signs of the fact that Saint Dominic was predestined to become a real shining light in the cosmos of Christianity. The first one is the dream that his mother had, and these are more legends than history, of course. His mother had a dream. At verse 60, he says, sì la sua mente di viva virtute, che nella madre lei fece profeta. Nella madre, inside his mother, he made a prophet. So even before he was born, he made his mother a prophet, because the legend said that his mother dreamt of giving birth to a dog that was black and white, and black and white are the colors of the uniforms of the Dominicans. He was black and white and was carrying in his mouth a torch with a flame, and with this flame he was giving fire to the entire world. Poiché le sponsalizie fur compiute al sacro fonte, intra lui e la fede, there is a parallel scene to the wedding of St. Francis and Lady Poverty in the wedding of St. Dominic and faith here. Al sacro fonte means the sacred fountain, or for his baptism. Usi dotar di mutua salute. It's a beautiful, very short comment that means that St. Dominic and faith basically saved each other. Faith, of course, saved St. Dominic, but St. Dominic also was there to save faith and the life of the church. La donna che per lui l'assenso diede, this is the second sign of predestination. La donna, this woman, is St. Dominic's godmother. She had to give the approval or confirmation for his baptism, and she also had a prophetic dream about him. In fact, she dreamt about St. Dominic as a child with a star on his forehead that was lighting the entire world. And finally, the third sign is his own name, that is possessive, like Dante says here, il possessivo di cui era tutto, because his name was Domenico, and Domenico from Latin means of the Lord. He belongs to the Lord. This is why Sunday in Latin, or in Italian, let's say in Italian, Sunday is Domenica, which is the day of the Lord, because it's the day that the Lord owns. In Spanish is Domingo, and so his name was Santo Domingo. E io ne parlo, verse 70, siccome dell'agricola che Cristo elesse all'orto suo per aiutarlo, ben parve messo a familiar di Cristo. Notice this triple rhyme with the word Cristo. Verse 71, 73, and 75. Cristo, Cristo, Cristo. This is the first time in Paradiso, but we'll see it later on as well in Paradiso, that Dante does this. Dante came to believe that there was no word in Italian that was worthy enough to rhyme with the word Cristo, with the word Christ. So he always made Cristo rhyme with itself. Somebody also says that it's because it was something of a penance or a penitence that Dante was doing, because in one of his earlier sonnets he had used the word Christo, or Christ, to mock a friend of his, and he felt ashamed, he felt bad about it, and so he kind of swore or elected that from that moment on he would only make the word Cristo rhyme with itself. It's also beautiful here how Dante starts using the metaphor of the vineyard. Siccome l'agricola che Cristo elesse all'orto suo per aiutarlo. So St. Dominic is not only the warrior, the fighter for Christ, but he's also the farmer. Let's see what Mandelbaum says. I speak of him as one whom Christ chose as the worker in his garden. So there is a gardening metaphor that will be echoed later on in the canto. Now let's try to be very clear about this difference between St. Francis marrying Lady Poverty and St. Dominic marrying Faith. These two type of images were very symbolic, but they didn't mean that St. Francis lacked any type of theological power, and that St. Dominic lacked any, let's say, ability to give value to the concept of poverty. So both of them were very much intertwined in their life. Only as a symbol, one was associated with one and the other with the other. This is why at verse 75, Dante says, fu al primo consiglio che die Cristo. The very first love that he showed, that Saint Dominic showed, was for the first injunction Christ had given, which was to give away all possessions and be poor and embrace poverty. Both of them, Saint Dominic and Saint Francis, founded orders that were called mendicant orders. They were sustaining themselves purely by asking for money to any people and Christians who would give them some money, but they didn't have any possessions. This is what a mendicant order was. However, Saint Dominic came into history as a saint who had a stronger focus on theology and study, and with a more refined, let's say, intellect when it comes to sophisticated theology when compared to Saint Francis. Also, something else that is extremely important. Whenever we're talking about poverty, we generally just think about lack of money. And that's really not the first significance that poverty has in the New Testament. In the New Testament, poverty is first and foremost a spiritual poverty, something that starts from inside, and it means that we are, as Christians, people who say miserere to God. We are not, please have mercy on me. The money and the assets and wealth are not something evil per se. Francis and Dominic knew that. What's evil and what's really sinful is the disordered attachment to these goods. And so the problem is to possess. There's nothing wrong with possessing, but possess with detachment, knowing that there's something much more important than material goods, and with the fundamental desire to make the will of God. Saint Bonaventure keeps going with his celebration and narration of Saint Dominic's life, and he says at verse 76, spesse fiate fu tacito ed esto, trovato in terra dalla sua nutrice. Instead of being in his bed, sleeping like he was supposed to, he was found very often on the ground, just outside in the grass. And in these moments when they asked him, what are you doing? He would say, io son venuto a questo. This is what I'm living for. This is my goal in life, referring to humility and poverty, a spiritual humility and poverty. And here is Bonaventure leaving, let's say, space and room to his own emotions, where he says, O padre suo veramente felice, o madre sua veramente Giovanna. It's echoing the significance and the meaning in the meaning of the name Domenico, because Felice was the name of his father, and it's also a word that means happy. And Giovanna was the name of his mother, and it's a name that in itself, in its root, means the grace of God. So Dante is playing a little bit here. Se interpretata val come si dice. Non per lo mondo, per cui mo s'affanna, di retro ad Ostiense e a Taddeo, ma per amor della verace manna, in picciol tempo, gran dottor si feo. Saint Dominic didn't become a great theologian because he wanted to get anxious around the world, just like those priests that Dante mentioned in the previous canto, at the beginning of the previous canto, that are full of anxiety and ambition and competition with their theology studies for material reasons, being the best, competing, or maybe even getting some material benefits. But for the pure love of study, la verace manna is the true manna. The true manna is theology, the truth, the study of truth. And right after this, at verse 86, he reconnects with the metaphor of the vineyard by saying, tal che mise a circuir la vigna, che tosto in bianca se il vignaio è reo. This verse 71 that we just saw was talking about the garden. Now it's more specific, and he's talking more specifically about the vineyard. Then Saint Dominic went to meet with the Pope. Here is the seat. La sedia means the seat, the chair. And the Fugia benigna, this chair, this seat, once was kinder to the righteous poor, and now has gone astray, but not in itself, the chair itself, but in its occupant. as always, Dante distinguishes between the man, the person who is sitting on the chair, and the actual institution. And what Saint Dominic asked was not something that most of the other clergy were asking when they were in a meeting with the Pope. They were asking for material benefits. They were asking for some type of vacant benefice. They were asking for dispensations. But he simply asked a license to fight for the church and to preach against the heresies, because especially in Provence, where this Cathar heresy had been developing very fast, only the bishops were allowed to preach publicly. So the Pope gave him the permission to preach against these heretics in Provence, and that's what he did, and that's why he went to France to perform this job. The actual approval of his order, the Order of the Dominicans, came only later in 1216. It's in 1205 that Saint Dominic received this verbal approval to preach against the heresies. But it was more than 10 years later that the Dominicans were recognized officially by the Pope. So here is a really crucial tercet at verse 100. E negli sterpi eretici percosse, l'impeto suo più vivamente quivi, dove le resistenze eran più grosse. Where the heresies were stronger, Vanderbaum says, struck where the thickets of the heretics offered the most resistance. Like a torrent, St. Dominic's, with his impetus, came down on the heretics, in other words. And I think it's worth spending 1 minute at least here about this, the history of the Cathars and what this heresy was about. The Cathars had been developing a theology that was inspired by Christianity, of course, but that reached radically different conclusions from Christianity. And that's why they were very dangerous, not only physically, because they had started to persecute Christians, to act violently, to attack Christians in the provincial area, but also spiritually, because according to the Cathar philosophy or theology, the material world was really bad in itself, had been created by some demonic god, and therefore everything that was creation was really bad, which is in complete contrast and opposite to what Genesis says in the very first lines of Genesis, which is God made the world and looked at the world and he saw that it was good. It was good. Everything in the world, according to Christian theology, is good. So they said the opposite. And as a consequence of this, they preached things like, for example, not giving birth, or they looked at pregnant women as demonic creatures, and they preached abortion because men was not something that had to be proliferating. They had a intense hostility against the Catholic Church. So there were, as I mentioned, violent reactions in many different provincial villages against the churches. So there was an escalation of tension and violence. What was the role of Saint Dominic in all this? He actually participated to the crusade against the Albigensian Cathars. Not as a warrior, he participated as a spiritual teacher, as a preacher, and he preached for the Christians against the heretics. Di lui si fecero poi diversi rivi, onde l'orto cattolico si riga. Just like we saw in the previous canto, how the Franciscans multiplied and developed very quickly in a few years. From Dominic, many rivers and rivulets multiplied after Dominic, while his order grew and grew. Se tal fu l'una rota della biga, he's now comparing the church to a chariot again, which reminds us of the final cantos of Purgatorio, where the chariot was the metaphor, the allegory for the church. And here we have one wheel of this chariot that is St. Francis, and the other wheel that is St. Dominic. And so they give really that energy that the church needed to move forward. Then we get to verse 112, and this is a new part of the canto that starts. There is a separation between 111 and 112. Ma l'orbita che fe la parte somma di sua circonferenza è derelitta. The track traced by the outer rim of the will is abandoned now. Here starts the invective against his own order, against the Franciscans. In fact, there is a strange metaphor here that has to do with wine. Fundamentally, what Dante is saying is that good wine would leave in the empty barrel a crust, while bad wine would leave mold. That's why he's saying la muffa dov'era la gromma. And his family, the Franciscans, they were in the beginning moving and following St. Francis in his footsteps. Today, they are so turned around that they're actually putting their feet in his footsteps, but completely in the opposite way. In fact, in the years after St. Francis' death, there was a big risk actually of a schism already in his order. Like very often it happens actually. It's also in the history of the world when there is a great charismatic leader who dies. The way the Franciscans argued and fought with each other after Francis' death was in separating in two kind of movements within the Franciscan order. Ones were called, in Italian, they were called the conventuali, and the other ones were called the spirituali. The conventuals, we could say, they were admitting that each friar had to be poor and not possess anything. However, the convent of the friars at least needed some type of material goods for its own survival, a minimal, let's say, something. The spirituals were more fundamentalists, and they were taking the rule of St. Francis, that because St. Francis had left his own rule, too strictly, and they were saying that nothing, not even the convent, not the organization, nobody in the Franciscans had to own anything. And this not only was considered too strict, in fact Dante is discussing this at verse 124 and 25, but it had a risk within, because these spirituals were starting to almost detach themselves so much from material goods that they found some similarities with this heresy of the Cathars. So there was a danger of heresy there in the bend that the spirituals were taking. This is why in 1318, in fact, when Dante was writing Paradiso in 1318, Pope John the 22nd, he stepped in and resolved the dispute by excommunicating the spirituals. The point where Dante explains this is 124. Ma non fia da Casal né d'acqua sparta, là onde vegnon tali alla scrittura, cuno la fugge e altro la coarta. This Casal e Acqua Sparta are places where the two leaders of these two Franciscan movements, Ubertino da Casale, who was giving too restrictive an interpretation to the rule of St. Francis because he was a spiritual, and Matteo d'Acqua Sparta, who was giving a little bit of a too loose interpretation because he wasn't faithful enough to the concept of poverty. So not one and not the other had the right type of perfect balance when reading and interpreting the rule of St. Francis. In the last portion of the canto, Saint Bonaventure introduces himself, and he introduces very, very quickly all the names of the 12 new souls, the new blessed saints, blessed souls that we have here. These souls are all theologians, philosophers, and they are big names. Some of them I actually do not recognize personally because I never heard about them or read their work. However, I know that there is a slight difference between the souls in the first 12 in the first circle and these souls in the second circles. The first ones were more Aristotelians, while these ones are more mystics. For some reason, Dante decided to choose this type of differentiation. And finally, Saint Bonaventure concludes by saying it was this Cotanto Paladino to exalt, to celebrate this Paladino, who is Dominic. I was stimulated by St. Thomas and his great Latin, his monologue that he just gave you. This is why I was inflamed to give this celebration of Saint Dominic. There will be so much more to say about this canto, historically, poetically. I loved it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. In any case, we'll speak soon for Canto 13.